Hi, everybody, and welcome back. We are going to be talking about resumes in the hospitality industry. And I just want to point out some really helpful things that hopefully help you when you are putting together your resume. Yes, we all have a resume. I'm sure that almost everybody watching this video may be saying, well, I already have a resume, but there may be things that you don't know about building resumes that you really do need to know about. So let me share my screen here. And we will talk about some of the things that you need to know about your resume and make sure that you are thinking about while putting that resume together. One thing that I want to say, and I say to all my students, is your resume should always be changing constantly. You should never be satisfied with it. It can always be better, mine and everybody else's. So always be bringing it up, even if you're not looking for a job. Every a couple times a year, bring it up on your computer and take a look at it and see if everything is up to date and if you can change it in one way or another. Now, I have attached a resume example to this particular module, and please save it. I hope that you do, and download it. Use it as an example of a good resume to use out there in the real world. There's a lot of reasons why you want to follow particular formats when it comes to resume building and that you may not be familiar with. Let's talk about the very first reason you want to be so conscious of how you're putting your resume together and what it looks like. And that is because of the applicant tracking system, which is ATS, and I'm going to be talking about that a fair amount today. When you submit a resume online, and almost every job today that you're going to be applying for, you have to apply online. You guys all know that. Well, especially with bigger companies, it's actually not a recruiter or an HR person getting on the other side, getting your resume. It actually goes through an ATS system first, and the ATS system reads your resume and decides in many cases if it's going to go any further or not before any human ever sees it. And it may, and in many cases, knocks people out of the running completely because of the way their resume is set up. And so you need to be very conscious of that and very well aware of that. So that's the first thing that you can see here on this slide of the PowerPoint. And this also, the PowerPoint is also attached to this module. Be aware of templates. Do not use templates from Word or any where online that you may get them. The reason is because of the ATS. A lot of times, ATSs cannot read your template. And what it does is it automatically rejects it. And so if you've been sending out a whole bunch of resumes and you're not getting any answers, nothing coming back at all, could be because of an ATS system. And so you need to correct your resume immediately before you send out any more resumes. And that's a big one. And also text boxes. So if you're in an application where you're putting together a text box and then you transport it into Word, for example, that text box, the entire text box may not be able to be read by ATS. And again, you may be completely rejected before a human ever sees it, and a human doesn't get to see it, and you're not being even considered for a lot of jobs. So be very, very aware of ATS, really important stuff. And there's the text boxes that I was just talking about. Make sure that you're not doing that as well. One of the things that I talk to students about all the time when it comes to resumes is there's only one purpose, and only one purpose alone for a resume. It is not to tell your life story. It is not to tell everything there is to know about what you have done in the past with your jobs. The only purpose for a resume is to get an interview. That's it. So don't try to tell your life story. Most of us want to put our life story in a resume. And many people need to be told you need to cut back. I get it. I do the exact same thing on my resume. So you want to make sure that you get to the point and don't go on and on and on, because you're going to bore people. People aren't going to read your resume, and it may be rejected because you only have a few minutes with that person looking at it, especially in our industry when it comes to hourly positions and assistant manager positions. I know when I used to be in the position of a manager or director and I was hiring somebody and I had 100 resumes on my desk, I would go through them very quickly. You may have 45 seconds to 2 minutes with me. I'm looking for very specific things, and if it's just packed full of stuff, you're probably going to get rejected by me. So keep that in mind. Get to the point. Something also important, though, that as you move up the ladder, your resume will change, and it will have more detail in it. When you're younger and you are in hourly positions or assistant manager positions, generally speaking, you want to keep it very short, sweet, and to the point. So keep that in mind. Your resume is going to be changing over time. First impressions. Your very first impression that you're going to be giving somebody without them meeting you is, in fact, your resume and your cover letter. And so it's really important that it's as perfect as it possibly can be, and that you're constantly updating it. You're constantly making sure that things are correct in it. So your resume is so important, and I don't see this ever changing. Yeah, today we're handing or you're submitting it through an ATS system, your resume, but your resume, for the most part, it really hasn't changed that much since I was a kid, and the reason is because you need it. It's that first impression of somebody looking at you and figuring out, do they want to actually meet you and bring you in for an interview? So the first impression is very important. Here's a few things about a resume. Make sure it's not too wordy. I already talked about that. Make sure your fonts are not too small or too big. Generally speaking, fonts should be between 10, 11, 12. 12 can be too big if you have too much information. Hopefully you get your resume on one page, especially if you are under 25 years old. If you are 45, that's a very different thing. Your resume may be 3 or 4 pages long. So again, it really depends upon where you are in your career, how old you are, what you've been doing in the past. Using email addresses that are not appropriate, sexkitten@gmail, don't do that kind of thing. I know it sounds stupid, but you'd be amazed at what some people actually put on your resume. Hyperlinks, don't use hyperlinks on a resume. For example, if there's an underscore, it's hard to tell if there's an underscore. I just would not use hyperlinks on a resume. Bolding, make sure that if you're going to bold something or put something in bold, that's very important. You want to limit that because you don't want a whole bunch of highlighting on your resume. You only want those really important things to stand out. So think about that when you are putting something in bold. We no longer put, this was many, many years ago, we got rid of this, but interests or hobbies. I'm not interested if you like to ride horses, that kind of thing. Now, can you talk about that in the interview? Absolutely. Those may be very appropriate things to be talking about, or may not. It depends on what it is. Things like on your resume, references upon request. Do not put that on the bottom of the resume. Everybody knows that if they want a list of references from you, all they have to do is let you know that they want that. They're going to email or ask for it in an interview. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit as well. Uh, Using fonts, as long as it's relatively conservative, I myself have been using Arial on all my fonts for many, many years. You can change your defaults. All your systems come with Times Roman default. That is one that I put on here. Don't use. It is not a current looking font. It's difficult for adults to read, so I recommend definitely don't be using Times Roman. If you want to change your font, you can change your default actually on your Word documents, and I encourage you to do that for all of your documents. Another font not to use is Courier. Most of you, I bet, don't even know what that is. That's the old typewriters. When I was a kid, when I was really young, we didn't have computers back then. We had literally typewriters. That's what we had to use. And you don't want to make it look like you use a typewriter today. I'm going to tell you just a quick story. I have another another institution that I teach at. I was communicating via email with him, and he uses Courier font in his emails, and it makes him look like he's an idiot. It really does. I hate to say it that way, but it makes him look like he is not with it, and that he is so old that it's time for him to go. So my point is, make sure you're using fonts that are appropriate for today's world of resumes and emails and so on. So don't don't uh, don't do that. Resume fonts, as I mentioned, 10, 11, 12 are usually appropriate. It all depends upon how much information that you have to put on your resume as well. For young folks, 1 page if possible. If you're a little bit older, like I say, 25 to 35, you may be 2 pages. It all depends on how many jobs you've had. And what your experience is, and it will change over time, as I mentioned before. Margins, make sure that they're not too wide and too high. All your your systems defaults, usually almost all of them, 1 inch from the top, 1 from the bottom, and 1 from each side. You can change that to get more information on your resume, but make sure that it's not too far out. Again, those ATSs won't be able to read it, so there's a reason for that. Don't use colors on your resume. Highlighting stuff, or meaning not putting stuff in bold, but different colors like borders, that kind of stuff. Don't do that. The reason is again, ATS. It may knock you out, and it may not be able to read it. Consistencies throughout your resume. It's one of the things when I was a manager or director and hiring people, the one thing I was looking for on your resume is to see, are you consistent? Just a simple example. If you live in the state of Colorado, you put in your address up on the top of the resume, CO, capital C, capital O, and then lower in your resume, you use talked about working in Denver, Colorado, and you spelled out the word Colorado, or you abbreviated the state of Colorado differently, capital C, small o. I'm looking for consistencies. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as it's consistent within your resume. That is the most important thing. My advice is always have other people looking at your resume and making sure that everything is in fact consistent. You can look at something a million times and you're never going to be able to see that it's consistent or not consistent. I'm the same way. Have somebody else look at your resume and making sure that everything is consistent throughout. Placing job description information, I recommend in bullet point form. Again, that may change as you get older and that you go into different positions like district management positions. You may use paragraphs maybe later on, but especially when you're younger and in these a little bit lower jobs, I would use bullet points. Don't worry about complete sentences. I would also not try to wrap a sentence, making a sentence really long. Again, don't try to change or tell your life story. The purpose of a resume is to get an interview. Once you're in the interview, then tell your life story. Other things, using jobs that are only a few months in length, you need to think about that. Number one, if you have a whole bunch of jobs that you've only been in for a few months, and I'm not talking about seasonal jobs, that's something that's different, then you have a different challenge, and that is that you're probably job jumping, and you have some other issues. However, if you have a couple of jobs that you've been at for a couple of years, you have one job that you were only at for 3 months or 2 months, do you include that? That's up to you. I personally would probably just simply get rid of it. You don't want just to indicate to a recruiter or to an HR person that you are job hunting, and that's something obviously very important. Jobs where somebody else has been promoted a number of times. Actually, if you've been at a job for 15 years and you've worked at 5 different jobs within that 15 years, that's a great thing, by the way. The resume sample that I have attached gives that example on how to do that kind of formatting. And for me personally, that's one of the most difficult things to do on a resume, to have it stand out that you've been there for 15 years, but you've had 5 different jobs within that 15 years. So this is just a real simple setup as far as formatting. I would not use the comma as I have in the first part here, 2028. I would use, and I wouldn't use the actual day itself, July 19th. Why would you, for example, when you started your job, nobody cares about the actual day itself. The month is fine, and even in some cases, you may not want to even use the month, especially if you're trying to, quote, hide a couple of jobs that were short term. It's a good way of doing it. I use, actually, I'll use July and then the year. And actually what I'll do is abbreviate all of my months, and I mentioned this later on, to 3 letters. So obviously May is only 3 letters, but if it's June, it's Jun, September, SEP, that's it. It keeps your wording as short as possible. So that's something to think about. And there you go. That's what I was talking about, abbreviating on a resume, which is completely appropriate to do. Again, as long as you're consistent. Complete sentences, I mentioned that before. Don't worry about using complete sentences. Overall formatting, the same on the resume, your letter, and your reference page. And you should have a reference page, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what am I talking about? If you're sending in your resume and a cover letter to somebody, your look should be the same on both. It shouldn't be 2 completely different fonts. You want it to make it look like there was a reason, and you have it together, and that you know what you're doing. If you use completely different fonts on your and sizes on your resume, it's going to look like they don't belong together. So make sure you're thinking about that. I'm not telling you never have anything different. I'm not saying that. But make sure that you're really thinking about that, and it makes sense that your fonts and your sizes match up and look good, and are appropriate. Now, I mentioned many students do this. Don't put references on your resume itself. Don't put who your boss was. Don't put phone numbers on there on your resume. You should have a reference document. It's totally separate from your resume. Generally speaking, unless it's asked for, you do not submit it when you're applying online, but you always want to make sure you have it. Now, what is that? It should be just a page that should say professional or personal, or maybe both, references on it. I'm not, when I was hiring people, I'm going to be honest, I could care less about your personal references, because if you're going to have Aunt Sally on there, you're going to tell Aunt Sally to say wonderful things about you. So I don't really care what Aunt Sally has to say. Who I'm interested in is your previous bosses, supervisors, managers. And even if it was somebody from the past, a job that you were at 5 years ago, that manager more than likely has gone on someplace else and in a new position. Put formally and put their last position put their new email address, put their phone number and their new address on the reference page, and make sure that you've talked to those people that and ask them, is it okay if I use you as a reference? Almost all the time they're going to say yes, especially if you got along with them and you have a good relationship with them. Make sure you keep in contact with them from time to time. But that's really important to do. But make sure that you put that on a separate page, and make sure that it's printed out. So when you go on an actual interview, that if the person says, oh, and by the way, I'm going to need references, you can pull it right out of your portfolio type holder with a notepad in it. You know what I'm talking about, and you can give it to them. That way, they're going to think to themselves, wow, this person's really on top of it. I didn't even have to ask them and have them send it via email later. You can give it to them in hard copy form right then and there. So things to think about. Other suggestions? Oh, this is not a suggestion. You better do it. This is reverse chronological order. I'm always amazed at students that don't do this. What does reverse chronological order means? It's simple. Is you put the last job that you have currently or your current position first. Does that make sense? So it's your job you have now, or at least the last one you had. And as they get older, they should be going down the page. Here's where students mess up all the time. Under education, they do the opposite. It should be where you are right now, and going, if you have previous educational institutions, they should also go in reverse chronological order. Again, many students mess that up. Tense, what do I mean by that? On your resume, your past jobs, you should be saying things like completed, supervised, computed. I'm just thinking of things off the top of my head. But for your current position, it's current tense. So it would be supervise, or I control, or whatever the verbs that you want, that you're using. Make sure that you're thinking about the tense. A lot of people mess that up. Order of education and work experience. Generally speaking, your work experience is going to go on top of your education. There are exceptions to that. If you're in a strange situation, throw me an email. We can talk about it. Volunteer work. If you don't have volunteer work, you haven't done volunteer work in the past, my recommendation is start doing it. Number one, hopefully you're giving back to the community and you're giving back to society. But the number two is for your resume. When I saw volunteer work on a resume, I got excited. What that told me, it told me a lot about the person who was applying with me. It told me that they are willing to give of their life, of their time for free, and to give to others of their time and their life for free. And so volunteer work, that doesn't mean you have to go to and work at a soup kitchen, twice a week. It doesn't mean that. If you worked at a homeless shelter or some other organization, it could even be, the YMCA, and you volunteer there, and you volunteer once every 2 months. You don't have to say that on your resume. You could put, though, that you're continually doing it. And if you've been working and volunteering at the YMCA for the last 5 years, and that's on your resume, that again tells a lot about who you are as a person. And if they ask you in the interview how often you volunteer, tell them the truth. But it really helps. So think about volunteer work. Organization affiliations. If you are putting things like NRA, make sure that the people who are reading it know what NRA means. Meaning, I would not recommend putting National Rifle Association on there, since it is a association that is politically enthralled in our world today. The NRA, for most of us in this industry, means the National Restaurant Association. I personally would spell that out. But those are important things to put on your resume as well, is organization affiliations, especially if you are active members, not just a member on a piece of paper, but that you are super active in an organization. Don't focus too much on job duties. Meaning, don't put too much information in job duties. Make sure that you keep it short, sweet, to the point. Typos and misspellings, have other people check your spelling. I do it all the time. I'm a horrible speller. I admit it. What do? I have somebody else take a look at my resume. References on a separate piece of paper. I already said that. Photos, I won't talk about why you don't do this, but in other countries, you do actually use photos on a resume. We don't in this country, do not put it there unless there's a very specific reason for it. And that's very, very rare. And what type of paper do you use? That's when you go to an interview itself, you should have a hard copy with you or a couple of hard copies with you. Even though you had emailed your resume, you always want to be able to say, oh, do you need a hard copy of my resume? The person 99% of the time is going to say, nope, I don't need it. But if they do, you can say, here's my copy. And you want to, I'd put it on very resume paper, which is either white or beige, very simple. And a heavier duty paper, you can go to Staples or any of those kind of places and buy a ream of resume paper. Certainly there are tons of people that can help you out with doing that. So I'm going to wrap it up. I hope that this has helped you putting your resume together. This is a big thing, and hopefully you will be working on your resume for the rest of your life, or at least until you retire and you know that you don't want a job again in your life. There you go. Until the next time, I hope that you have a great week or a great weekend, and see you soon. Take care.